Joan Park adjusted his formal diplomatic uniform as he entered the massive crystal hall on Astra Prime. The ceiling soared impossibly high above, catching light from 3 moons visible through transparent panels. As Earth's lieutenant commander and junior diplomatic representative, he had never expected to attend such an important event, the coronation of the Astran Empress. Remember the protocol, his superior had warned before sending him. Mirror the other diplomats' gestures, speak only when addressed, and above all, don't stand out. June nodded to various alien delegates as he moved through the crowd. The Astrans were striking beings, tall and graceful with silvery skin that seemed to shimmer under the crystalline lights. Most noticeable were their 6 arms, each moving with practiced precision as they conversed. Their language sounded like wind chimes and flowing water. "The Empress approaches," announced a court official in the universal diplomatic language. All delegates prepare for formal greeting. June took his position in line behind representatives from 47 worlds. His translator device buzzed softly at his ear, converting the official's continuing announcements. "This is just ceremonial," whispered an orange-skinned diplomat beside him. "Watch the person ahead and copy them exactly." When his turn came, June stepped forward and faced Empress Minji. She was taller than the other Astrans, with intricate patterns glowing beneath her translucent skin. Her 6 arms wore ceremonial bands, and a floating crown of crystal shards hovered above her head without touching it. The delegate before June, an ancient, tentacled being, performed an elaborate series of movements. As instructed, June carefully mirrored these gestures, raising his arms in specific patterns and bowing at precise angles. As he completed the final motion, touching his right wrist with his left hand while bowing deeply, a strange silence fell across the hall. June froze, wondering what mistake he had made. "The human invokes the sacred binding," the court official announced, voice echoing with surprise. June's translator seemed to struggle with the terms, finally producing, "Earth representative has performed ancient loyalty ritual. Bond claim accepted." The Empress's iridescent eyes widened. She studied June with new interest while whispers spread through the gathered delegates. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked, her melodic voice somehow both gentle and powerful. I was following protocol," June stammered, diplomatic training failing him in this unexpected situation. "You have performed the eternal bond ritual," the Empress explained. "It has not been seen in our court for 3 centuries. By our most sacred laws, you have pledged yourself as my bound advisor and protector, a life commitment that cannot be broken." June felt blood drain from his face. There must be some mistake. I was simply mirroring the delegate before me. "The Viridian ambassador is our oldest ally," explained a court official who stepped forward. "They alone maintain knowledge of the ancient bonding gestures. We assumed you knew what you were doing." June's mind raced. This was a diplomatic disaster. He had accidentally committed himself, and by extension, Earth, to some kind of life service to an alien empress. "Can it be undone?" he asked, trying to maintain composure. The gathered Astrans made a sound like crystal chimes, their version of shocked gasps. "The bond is sacred and permanent," the Empress stated. "Breaking it would bring grave dishonor and," she paused, searching for the right words, "significant physical consequences for both parties." As she spoke, Jun felt a strange warming sensation on his right wrist. Looking down, he watched as a faint pattern appeared on his skin, swirling lines that glowed with subtle blue light, matching markings on the Empress's uppermost right arm. "The bond confirms," announced the court official. "It is done." Several Astran officials huddled around the Empress, speaking rapidly in their native language. June caught urgent tones and gestures toward him. This was clearly unprecedented. "I need to contact Earth Command," Jun said, trying to sound calm. "This is beyond my authority." "You will be permitted communication soon," the Empress said, raising a hand to silence her advisors. "But first understand this. What has happened cannot be undone without serious consequences for relations between our worlds. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. No off-worlder has ever been bound to Astran royalty. Some will see this as an opportunity, others as a threat to our traditions. June swallowed hard. His simple diplomatic mission had just become infinitely more complicated. Until we determine how to proceed, the Empress continued, you will be given quarters in the palace and treated with the respect due your new position. As royal guards appeared to escort him away, June caught fragments of conversation from nearby officials. The mark on his wrist pulsed gently, and somehow June sensed the Empress's own uncertainty and curiosity. This connection was real, whatever it was. I will honor the commitment I have made, June found himself saying, diplomatic training taking over. Though it was unintended, I will not disrespect your traditions. Something shifted in the Empress's expression. Surprise, followed by what might have been approval. Perhaps fate has designs we do not yet understand, she said. Welcome to the Imperial Court, Park June of Earth. As he followed the guards from the hall, Jun realized his life had just changed forever, all because he followed instructions too perfectly. June woke in his palace quarters, momentarily forgetting where he was until the crystal walls shifted from sleep blue to morning amber. 3 weeks had passed since the accidental binding ceremony. 3 weeks of confusion, protocol lessons, and increasingly frustrated messages from Earth Command. He dressed in the Astran-made clothing provided for him, lightweight fabric that adjusted to his body temperature. The cut mimicked his Earth uniform, but incorporated elements marking his new status as Imperial bound. The mark on his wrist pulsed gently, his constant reminder of connection to Empress Minji. A soft chime announced a visitor. The doorway dissolved to reveal Imperial Advisor Taiho, his translucent skin barely concealing his displeasure. The morning meal awaits, Taiho said stiffly. The Empress requests your presence afterward at the Strategic Council. Another council meeting? June asked, following the Astran into the corridor. Yesterday's session lasted 6 hours. The Empress values your perspective, Taiho replied, making the last word sound like an insult. Though why she honors the mistake of a primitive species remains beyond understanding. June had learned to ignore such comments. Many court officials viewed him as either an embarrassment or a threat. Walking these hallways felt like navigating a minefield. One wrong step could trigger an interstellar incident. The dining hall bustled with activity as court officials ate their morning meal. Conversation stopped when June entered. He had grown accustomed to the stares and whispers. Park June, called a friendly voice. Jury, a junior science advisor, and one of the few Astrans who treated him with genuine interest, waved him over. Her 6 arms moved in the grading pattern reserved for equals. The palace is buzzing with news, Jury said as June sat beside her. The Empress has assigned you quarters in the royal wing. That can't be right, Jun said, nearly choking on his food. It is. The royal wing houses only the Empress and her closest advisors. That will make some people unhappy, Jun observed, noticing several officials glaring in his direction. Some believe the binding was a calculated human plot, Jury admitted. Others think you should be grateful for the honor. And what do you think? Jun asked. Jury's skin rippled with thoughtful blue patterns. I think it will be interesting to see what happens when different worlds truly connect. After breakfast, Taiho led Jun to the Strategic Council chamber. 12 high-ranking Astrans sat around a circular table, with Empress Minji at its head. The room fell silent as Jun entered. The human arrives at last, General Ju said, her lower arms twitching with irritation. Now we can discuss matters of actual importance. The bound advisor has a name, Empress Minji said calmly. And as I have explained, his perspective is now part of our council. She gestured to an empty seat at her right hand, a position that clearly disturbed several council members. We were discussing the border situation, the Empress continued as June sat down. The Nexus collective ships have violated our territory 3 times this month. A holographic display appeared above the table, showing star systems and ship movements. June studied it carefully. Our traditional response would be a display of military force, General Ju said. We should send a battle group immediately and risk starting a war over what might be navigation errors, asked another advisor. As the council argued, Jun noticed something in the ship movement patterns. They seemed deliberate, almost like, "Your Radiance," he said carefully, aware that interrupting was considered rude. "May I make an observation?" The council members stared at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outrage. "Proceed," the Empress said. "These violations follow a pattern," Jun explained, pointing to the display. "On Earth, we've seen similar tactics in historical conflicts. They're probing your defenses, but not to prepare for immediate attack. They're mapping your response patterns, learning how quickly you react, with what force, and through which routes." Silence followed his words. "Ridiculous," General Ju finally said. "The human suggests the Nexus employs primitive Earth tactics." "Perhaps," Jun replied calmly, "but these primitive tactics worked against advanced civilizations throughout Earth's history." The Empress studied the display with new interest. "What would you suggest?" "Vary your responses. Send different-sized forces each time, through unpredictable routes. Make them waste resources trying to find patterns that don't exist." Several council members began speaking at once, some dismissing his ideas, others considering them. "Enough," the Empress said, raising one hand for silence. "We will implement Advisor Park's suggestion. If the incursions continue unchanged, we lose nothing. If they decrease, we gain valuable insight." As the meeting continued, Jun felt the eyes of the council upon him. He had just challenged centuries of Astran military doctrine. Some would never forgive this intrusion. When the council adjourned, the Empress asked Jun to remain behind. "You spoke directly today," she observed when they were alone. "Many found it disrespectful." "I apologize if I overstepped," Jun said. "Do not apologize for fulfilling your purpose," she replied. "The bond exists to bring new perspective when needed most. Your directness is refreshing." She moved to a window overlooking the capital city, gestures indicating he should join her. "My advisors see only threats to tradition," she said quietly. "They cannot understand that sometimes tradition itself becomes the threat." The mark on Jun's wrist warmed in response to her words. He was beginning to understand that their connection was more than symbolic. "I will try to be more diplomatic in future meetings," he offered. The Empress made a sound like gentle wind chimes, an Astran laugh. "Please do not. I have enough diplomats. What I need is truth, however uncomfortable it may be." Looking out at the alien cityscape, Jun realized his accidental position might be more important than anyone had imagined. Two worlds were colliding through him, and the impact would change them both forever. 3 months into his unexpected position, Jun found himself in the Imperial Gardens with Empress Minji. The vast biodome contained plants from across the Astran Empire, creating a riot of colors and scents unfamiliar to human senses. For once, they were relatively alone. Only 2 guards stood at a respectful distance, and the garden's privacy fields prevented electronic surveillance. "Your suggestion to vary our patrol routes has proven effective," the Empress said, her 6 arms moving in graceful patterns as she examined a floating blue flower. "The Nexus incursions have decreased by more than half." "I'm glad it helped," Jun replied. "Earth's military history is unfortunately rich with examples of deception and counter-deception." "A useful perspective," Minji said. She touched the floating flower with her uppermost right hand, and it immediately bloomed wider, releasing golden pollen that sparkled in the artificial sunlight. Jun had learned to read Astran body language over the past months. The way the Empress held her middle arms, slightly tense, close to her body, suggested she had something important to discuss. "May I ask you something directly, Your Radiance?" Jun said. "Of course. Why didn't you correct my mistake during the binding ceremony? You must have recognized what was happening." The Empress stilled, all 6 arms freezing in place momentarily, a sign of surprise that her emotions had been detected. "You've become quite observant of our mannerisms," she noted. "Necessity is a good teacher." Indeed. She began walking down a crystal path, gesturing for him to follow. "The truth is complex. The Astran Empire has maintained power through technological superiority and rigid tradition for millennia. Both advantages are now fading." She paused near a small stream that flowed upward against gravity. "The Nexus Collective grows stronger because they adapt and incorporate other species' innovations. Meanwhile, our advisors suggest solutions that worked centuries ago, unable to imagine new approaches." "And you thought a human perspective might help?" June asked. "The binding was originally created to incorporate wisdom from other species. That practice ended when we became convinced of our superiority." Her middle arms performed a gesture June had learned meant regret. "I did not plan for you specifically to perform the ritual, but when you did, I saw an opportunity." One of the garden drones drifted closer, a subtle reminder that they were never truly private. "There are those in my court who see any change as weakness," she continued more formally. "They would rather see the empire crumble than evolve. So you used my mistake to bring in outside thinking without directly challenging tradition," June realized. "Yes, though I did not anticipate how effective you would be," she admitted. "The incident with the ambassador from Telmos last week demonstrated that clearly." June winced at the memory. The Telmos ambassador had attempted to force unfavorable trade terms by exploiting Astran politeness protocols, until June had intervened with decidedly un-Astran directness. "I should have been more diplomatic," he said. "You achieved in one meeting what my negotiators failed to accomplish in 6, the Empress replied. "The ambassador respected your willingness to break protocol in defense of our interests." They reached a clearing where crystal structures amplified the light, creating rainbow patterns on the ground. "Tomorrow's council meeting will be challenging," Minji said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "General Juwu will propose increasing military presence along all borders, an expensive show of force we cannot sustain." "You want me to oppose her," Jun guessed. "I want you to offer alternatives. Coming from me, such ideas would appear weak. Coming from you, they are simply foreign." June understood the strategy. As an outsider, he could propose ideas that would be political suicide for the Empress to suggest directly. "And when they attack my ideas?" he asked. "They will," she agreed. "But they cannot attack me for considering all perspectives before making a decision." The cleverness of this approach struck June. His status as both outsider and bound advisor created a unique position. He could introduce radical concepts while the Empress maintained traditional authority. "There's another matter," Minji said, her upper arms making a gesture that indicated a change of topic. "Your Earth government continues to demand your return." "I expected that," Jun said. The faint mark on his wrist seemed to pulse in response to the topic. "They do not understand the nature of the bond," she continued. "They view it as a diplomatic inconvenience rather than a biological and spiritual connection." June had felt the truth of this connection growing stronger each day. He sensed the Empress's emotions, especially when they were close, just as she seemed aware of his. "What happens if Earth insists?" he asked. The Empress's skin darkened slightly, an Astran expression of concern. The next day, June sat at the Empress's right hand as the Nexus delegation entered the Grand Hall. The ambassadors were a mix of species, united under the collective's banner. Their leader, Ambassador Ken, had skin like burnished copper and 4 eyes that constantly scanned the room. "The Astran Empire honors the Nexus Collective with this meeting," the Empress began formally. Ambassador Ken smiled, showing pointed teeth. "The Collective appreciates the Empire's willingness to discuss new terms. Our previous arrangements have become inadequate." What followed was unlike any negotiation the Astran court had witnessed. The Nexus representatives made aggressive demands, interrupted court officials, and violated numerous diplomatic protocols. The Astran negotiators, trained in centuries of formal diplomacy, were clearly flustered. Advisor Tejo struggled to maintain composure as Ambassador Ken demanded access to restricted Astran trade routes. Jun observed carefully, noting the Nexus tactics. They were creating confusion to hide their true objectives. When Ambassador Ken suddenly suggested a private meeting between decision-makers only, Jun recognized the trap. "Your Radiance," he whispered to the Empress. "They're attempting to isolate you from your advisors." The Empress nodded subtly. Then, to everyone's surprise, she spoke directly to Ken. "The Astran Empire appreciates directness," she said, "but we do not appreciate deception. Your apparent goal is access to our quantum communication network, not the trade routes you claim to want." Ambassador Ken's 4 eyes blinked rapidly in surprise. "Perhaps we should reset this discussion," the Empress continued. "My bound advisor from Earth has suggested a different approach." She gestured to Jun, who stood and addressed the delegation using negotiation tactics familiar to them. Direct, focused on mutual benefit, and without the ceremonial language that Astrans typically used. By the day's end, the foundations for a fair trade agreement had been established. The Nexus representatives departed looking both surprised and satisfied. "Your approach was effective," the Empress told Jun when they were alone. "They did not expect such adaptability from our side." "Earth diplomacy can be useful," Jun agreed, "though some of your court seemed shocked by the directness." "They will adjust," she said. Then, more quietly, "Have you decided about Earth's demand?" Jun thought about his home planet, his career, his former life. Then he considered what he had built here, a unique position that benefited both worlds. "I'm staying," he said simply. "Earth will protest, but they'll eventually see the value of having me here." The mark on his wrist glowed briefly, reflecting the relief he sensed from the Empress. "We have much work ahead," she said. "Yes," Jun agreed, "and I intend to see it through." Jun noticed the problem during the 3rd day of the Nexus Trade Summit. After 6 months in the Imperial Palace, he had learned its rhythms and patterns. The regular guard rotation at the main entrance was delayed by exactly 8 minutes. The security drones in the eastern corridor were fewer than usual. The personal guards of several council members were mysteriously absent. Small changes, but together they formed a pattern that made Jun uneasy. He leaned closer to Empress Minji during a break in the negotiations. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "Security positions have shifted throughout the palace." Before she could respond, the Grand Hall's lights dimmed. Emergency protocols engaged, casting the room in a soft red glow. The Nexus delegates looked around in confusion. "Usurper." The accusation echoed through the hall as Supreme General Juwu stepped forward, flanked by 20 elite guards. "Empress Minji has betrayed our traditions by allowing human influence to corrupt our sacred governance." Half the Astran officials in the room immediately knelt before General Juwu. The others froze, uncertain. "This is the prophesied sign of imperial decay," Juwu continued, her voice carrying easily through the vast space. "When the ruler values foreign whispers over Astran wisdom. This is treason," Minji stated calmly, though Jun could feel her tension through their bond. "It is restoration," Juwu countered. "The human will be executed, and you will abdicate in favor of a ruler who respects our ways." Jun quickly assessed their position. The loyal guards were outnumbered. The Nexus delegation had been trapped in the corner of the hall, prevented from interfering or witnessing too much of this internal conflict. Jun touched his wrist communicator, a gift from Yuri that included modifications not approved by palace security. "Your Radiance," he said formally. "Emergency protocol Sunflower." Confusion flickered across General Juwu's face, just long enough for Jun's signal to take effect. Throughout the palace, environmental systems that Jun had quietly reprogrammed responded. Key sections plunged into darkness, others filled with harmless but disorienting mist. "Take position 3, Jun whispered to Minji. The Empress immediately understood. Over the past months, Jun had insisted on preparing for various emergencies. Another human oddity the court had mocked. Now, those preparations proved vital. As chaos erupted, loyal forces executed the coordinated response Jun had trained them for. The palace guards loyal to the Empress moved with unexpected precision, using tactics borrowed from Earth military history rather than traditional Astran formations. General Juwu's forces, expecting a conventional response, found themselves outmaneuvered. When the lights returned to normal 20 minutes later, the coup attempt had failed. General Juwu and 11 high-ranking conspirators were surrounded by loyal guards. "You see," Juwu spat at the Empress, "he has infected you with human thinking." This response violated every tradition of imperial defense, and succeeded because of it, the Empress replied. She stood tall, all 6 arms in the formal position of imperial authority. "Take the traitors to the security level." As the conspirators were led away, Jun noticed the Nexus delegates watching with great interest. Ambassador Qin caught his eye and made a gesture of respect, one soldier to another. Later that evening, after security had been restored and the palace locked down, the Empress addressed her remaining court officials. The throne room was noticeably emptier after the arrests. "Today we witnessed both treachery and loyalty," she announced, "and we saw the value of embracing new perspectives rather than fearing them." Her gaze fell on Jun, who stood respectfully to the side. "The bond exists for a reason," she continued. "Our ancestors understood that strength comes from diversity, not isolation. It is time we remembered their wisdom." After the address, the Empress invited Jun to her private study, a room few outsiders had ever entered. Crystal walls displayed star maps and historical records, constantly shifting as if alive. "You anticipated this," she said when they were alone. "I suspected General Juwu might attempt something," Jun admitted. "She made her feelings about me and you quite clear. Yet you prepared specifically for today. It wasn't a question." Jun hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I noticed communications between Juwu and several officials increased after the Nexus delegation arrived. The timing made sense. Attack during negotiations when security would be focused outward, not inward." The Empress studied him with new appreciation. "Human pattern recognition continues to impress me." "I'm just glad the plan worked," Jun said. "Reconfiguring the environmental systems was Juri's idea. She's been a valuable ally." "Yes," the Empress agreed. "She will be promoted to Senior Science Advisor. We need more officials who embrace innovation." She moved to a crystal panel that changed to display the palace security grid. "General Juwu had more supporters than I realized," she said quietly. "Some still remain hidden." "What will happen to her?" Jun asked. "Traditionally, execution," the Empress said. "But perhaps there are better ways to handle traitors." "What would Earth do?" "Imprisonment, trial, rehabilitation when possible," Jun suggested. "Death doesn't solve the underlying problem. It just creates martyrs." The Empress considered this. Another new perspective to consider. She touched a control, and the security display vanished, replaced by a star map showing the Astran Empire and surrounding territories. "The coup attempt will strengthen our position with the Nexus Collective," she noted. Ambassador Qin was impressed by our quick response. "And by your willingness to adapt," Jun added. "The Nexus values flexibility." They stood together studying the star map, comfortable in shared silence. The bond mark on Jun's wrist glowed softly in the dim light, matching the brilliant pattern on the Empress's corresponding arm. "We must accelerate our plans," Minji finally said. "Juwu's supporters will regroup, and your Earth government continues to demand your return." "One crisis at a time," Jun replied with a small smile. "Isn't that what you told me when I first arrived?" For the first time since the coup attempt, the Empress's features relaxed into the Astran equivalent of a smile. "Indeed," she said, "though I'm beginning to think humans thrive on managing multiple crises simultaneously." "It's one of our better qualities," Jun agreed. Deep beneath the imperial palace lay the ancestral archives, Few Astrans ever visited this sacred place, and no off-worlder had ever been permitted entry, until today. June followed Archivist Yuna through crystal corridors that spiraled downward into the planet's crust. These records date back to the First Dynasty, Yuna explained, her tone more respectful than the disdain she had shown months earlier. Over 9,000 Earth years of imperial history. Thank you for allowing me access, Jun said. I follow the Empress's orders, Yuna replied, though without the bitterness such statements once carried. She believes you have earned this privilege. They reached a vast chamber where crystalline structures rose from floor to ceiling. Unlike the technology in the rest of the palace, these structures seemed almost alive, pulsing with internal light. What am I looking for? June asked. Information about the original purpose of the binding ritual, Yuna said. The Empress suggested you begin with the First Contact Chronicles from the Third Era. The archives used a biological interface unlike anything in human technology. Yuna showed June how to place his hand on a crystal surface that adjusted to accommodate his alien physiology. The information will flow directly into your mind, she warned. It may be disorienting for a human. June placed his palm on the cool surface. Immediately, images and concepts rushed into his consciousness, not quite translated, more like impressions directly stamped upon his mind. He saw strange worlds, unfamiliar species, and ancient Astrans with markings different from their modern descendants. Hours passed as June searched through the historical records. His head throbbed with the effort of processing so much alien information. Then, finally, he found what he sought. Later that evening, he requested an urgent meeting with the Empress. She received him in her private council chamber, dismissing her attendants with a gesture. You've discovered something important, she said, sensing his excitement through their bond. The binding was never meant to create servants, Jum said, still processing what he had learned. According to the earliest records, when Astrans first encountered other sentient species, they created the bond as a way to establish trust. The Empress's expression remained neutral, but Jun felt her interest sharpen through their connection. It was meant to be reciprocal, he continued. Both species would bond representatives to each other, creating a network of understanding. The physical connection prevented violence between bonded pairs and encouraged peaceful relations. That contradicts everything our current traditions teach, Minji noted, though she didn't seem surprised. The records show that over centuries, as the Astran Empire grew more powerful, the ritual changed. The reciprocal nature was eliminated. The bond became a mark of submission rather than mutual respect. Joan hesitated before adding the most sensitive discovery. Your ancestors deliberately altered the historical understanding to consolidate power. Instead of anger at this revelation, the Empress's expression showed satisfaction. You found exactly what I hoped you would find. She rose and approached a wall that transformed into a galactic display, showing the Astran Empire and surrounding territories. I've studied these records since becoming Empress, she admitted. I've been searching for a way to reform our empire without destroying its foundation. You already knew about the original bond, Jun realized. Yes, but I needed someone else to discover it independently, someone whose word would carry weight with both my people and other species. The galactic display zoomed out, showing how the Astran Empire had stopped expanding while other alliances, particularly the Nexus Collective, continued to grow. The Astran Empire is failing, June. Not militarily or economically, not yet, but philosophically. We have maintained power through isolation and supremacy, but the galaxy is changing. The Nexus grows because they incorporate rather than subjugate. Their strength comes from diversity. You want to return to the original meaning of the bond, Jun said, understanding dawning. Create actual alliances rather than demanding submission. Yes, but tradition is powerful among my people. I cannot simply declare a new interpretation without proof, without precedent. Her gaze met his. But a successful bond with a human that creates a foundation for change. That's why you didn't correct my mistake during the ceremony, Jun said. You were waiting for someone like me. I was hoping for a peaceful diplomatic exchange, she admitted, not a coup attempt and multiple crises. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Jun found himself laughing, a sound that still startled many Astrans. The best plans rarely survive first contact, your radiance. For the first time, the Empress joined in his laughter, the sound of their different species' expressions of amusement creating an unusual harmony. When their laughter subsided, Minji's expression grew serious again. There is something else you should know. The original bond had greater capabilities than our modern version. What do you mean? The true bond was designed to share more than just emotional awareness. With practice, bonded pairs could share knowledge, skills, even sensory experiences. The records describe it as two minds touching across the void of species difference. Jun looked down at the mark on his wrist. Is that possible for us? Our biologies are so different. The ancient records suggest the bond adapts to the paired species. She extended her marked arm. We could attempt to strengthen our connection using the original methods. What would that involve? Meditation, focused connection, and time. Her eyes met his. But first, we must decide if this is the path we wish to take. Strengthening our bond would make it even more difficult to break if Earth demands your return. Jun considered the implications. He had come to respect the Empress and her vision for reform. Through their bond, he sensed her sincerity, her genuine desire to create something better than the empire she had inherited. I believe in what you're trying to build, he said finally. If strengthening our bond helps create a new foundation for relations between our species, I'm willing to try. The Empress nodded solemnly. Then we begin tomorrow. The galaxy is changing, Park Jun. Together, we might help guide that change toward something better. 1 year after his accidental pledge, Jun stood beside Empress Minji in the grand ceremonial hall. Representatives from 23 species gathered to witness something unprecedented in modern galactic politics. The Earth delegation, led by Ambassador Suho, watched with cautious interest. Relations had improved after months of delicate negotiations. Today marks a return to ancient wisdom, Minji announced, her voice carrying effortlessly through the vast chamber. For too long, the Astran Empire has stood apart from the galactic community, seeing difference as inferiority rather than opportunity. Jun observed the assembled delegates. Some showed clear skepticism, others genuine curiosity. The Nexus collective representatives seemed particularly interested, their four-eyed faces focused intently on the proceedings. The human, Park Jun, did not make a mistake when he invoked the binding ritual, Minji continued. He opened a door our ancestors closed millennia ago, a door to mutual understanding and shared strength. At her signal, 23 pairs stepped forward from the crowd, each consisting of an Astran and a representative from another species. Jun had personally selected and trained the Astran participants, choosing those most open to new perspectives. Today, these volunteers will participate in the restored reciprocal binding, not as master and servant, but as equal partners in understanding. The ceremony that followed was adapted from the ancient records Jun had discovered. Each pair exchanged the ritual gestures, resulting in matching marks that glowed briefly before settling into their skin or equivalent biological surface. Jun felt a surge of emotion through his connection with Minji. Pride, hope, and a touch of vindication. Their bond had grown significantly stronger over the past months. Through dedicated practice of the ancient techniques, they had achieved what the historical records described: the ability to share thoughts, impressions, and even skills across the species barrier. When it was time for the Earth-Astran pairing, Ambassador Suho stepped forward alongside a young Astran diplomat named Chunho. Earth had initially rejected the concept of the binding entirely, but Jun's patient diplomacy and the intelligence advantages his position provided had eventually convinced Earth Command to participate in this experimental program. Earth accepts this bond in the spirit of mutual respect and understanding, Suho announced formally. After the ceremony concluded, Jun moved among the newly bonded pairs, offering guidance based on his experience. The reactions varied widely. Some pairs seemed immediately comfortable with their new connection. Others clearly struggled with the alien presence in their awareness. "It will take time," he reassured a nervous Earth scientist who had bonded with an Estran researcher. "The connection grows gradually, and you always maintain your separate identity." Later, as the delegates mingled in the reception hall, Ambassador Suo approached June. "Quite a transformation you've achieved here," Suo said, looking around at the diverse gathering. "When Earth Command sent you to that coronation, no one could have predicted this outcome." "I certainly didn't," June admitted. "There are still concerns about this binding process," Suo continued. "Some feel it's too intimate a connection to form with aliens." "The bond preserves individual identity while creating understanding," June explained. "It's not about becoming the other, it's about truly seeing them." Suho nodded thoughtfully. "Earth Command is watching this experiment carefully. If it succeeds, it could transform interstellar diplomacy." "That's the hope," June agreed. As Suo moved away to speak with other delegates, Empress Minji joined June. "It's working," she said quietly, surveying the gathering. "Already I can see connections forming." Through their bond, June sensed her deep satisfaction mixed with lingering concern. "The traditionalists will continue to resist," he acknowledged, responding to her unspoken worry. "Yes," she agreed. "Former General Juwu still has supporters, even in detention. This is just the beginning of a long process." "But a necessary one," June said. "The galaxy is changing. Isolation is no longer viable." They watched as an Astran diplomat and a Nexus representative engaged in animated conversation, their newly formed bond allowing a level of understanding that would have been impossible before. "Was it worth it?" Minji asked suddenly. "Giving up your return to Earth? Your previous life?" June considered the question seriously. He thought of his home planet, now visible only as a distant point of light in Astra Prime's night sky. He thought of his military career, now transformed into something entirely different. He thought of the family who communicated only through occasional transmissions. Then he looked at what he had helped create, the foundation of what might become the most significant interspecies alliance in known space. "Some mistakes turn out to be the best decisions we never intended to make," he answered. As they moved through the gathering, greeting delegates from across the galaxy, June noticed something remarkable. The atmosphere in the Imperial Palace had changed. Where once there had been rigid formality and suspicion, now there was genuine curiosity and exchange. The binding program would face challenges. Some pairs would struggle with their connection. Some political factions would resist the changes. Earth might eventually recall their participants if results didn't meet expectations. But a beginning had been made. A door closed for millennia had been reopened. "What comes next?" June asked as they paused near a window overlooking the capital city. "The bond pairs will serve as living bridges between our peoples," Minji replied. "They will spend time in each other's worlds, learning and sharing in ways formal diplomacy cannot achieve." "And us?" June asked. The Empress's 6 arms moved in a pattern he had come to recognize as determination. "We continue building," she said simply, "one connection at a time." The mark on June's wrist pulsed warmly in agreement, a permanent reminder that sometimes the most profound connections begin with a simple misunderstanding.